Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jim Byron. I am the President and CEO of the Richard Nixon Foundation, and I want to welcome you to the Nixon Library for an exciting evening, part of the Nixon Foundation's Distinguished Speakers Series, in partnership this evening with Chapman University's Presidential Studies program. I want to welcome and thank all the members of the Nixon Foundation's President's Council and the Associates Club, annual giving organizations that support the mission of the Richard Nixon Foundation. It's thanks to your support that this is really one of the most active Distinguished Speakers Series in Southern California. So thank you for what you do. This evening, we're going to hear about the exciting life and consequential legacy of one of the finest public servants of the 20th century. If there's anyone who, quote, did it all in life, it was Frank Carlucci. He served 6 presidents of both parties in many of the most senior roles in the federal government. Deputy Director of the CIA, National Security Advisor, Secretary of Defense. But before Frank Carlucci guided Cold War policy in the Reagan administration, he was recruited 15 years earlier into the Nixon administration by his friend Donald Rumsfeld. He served as Director of the Office of Economic Opportunity and then Undersecretary of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. In 1972, he coordinated the federal response to the devastating effects of Hurricane Agnes, a massive storm that slammed the eastern seaboard and particularly damaged Pennsylvania, which was Carlucci's home state. Agnes was the costliest hurricane to hit the United States at the time. For this, he became affectionately known as the father of FEMA, because this was before federal disaster relief protocols had been established. His thoroughly American life is told in a new book, Me Carlucci. A daughter recounts her father's legacy of service. And it's my pleasure to welcome Kristin Carlucci Weed, Secretary Carlucci's daughter. Her career in public policy research has taken her around the world, though she now lives in the leafy suburbs of Washington, D.C. When she is not driving one of her 3 children to their activities, she can be found on the tennis court or planning one of her upcoming globetrotting adventures. She is joined in conversation this evening by Frank Gannon, a former special assistant to President Nixon who later worked with the former president on the research and writing of RN, the Memoirs of Richard Nixon. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Kristin Carlucci Weed and Frank Gannon.
Hello, good evening.
Hello.
Welcome to Nixon East Room of Nixon Library in Yorba Linda, and welcome to Kristin, who has written a debut book that is terrific. It's and not an easy thing to do. It combines filial affection, because the subject is your father, with rigorous scholarship, because you've interviewed people and gone to other sources of resources, and has a nice prose style, so it's very readable, which is not always the case. So we have a lot to cover. Frank Carlucci, although he's kind of been hiding in plain sight, because although he has done so much and has affected our lives in so many ways, he did it almost stealthily, because he's sort of the proof of what President Reagan, the little slogan he had on his desk, that there's no limit to what you can accomplish as long as you don't care who gets the credit. And Frank Carlucci was a man who just can do, did do, and then moved on to the next thing without lingering and without tooting his own horn, which was why presidents of both parties, 6 presidents of both parties, turned to him in many cases, particularly Nixon case in point, in desperate need when a hurricane of unprecedented force hit New York and hit the Northeast, and particularly New York and Pennsylvania. So we have a lot to cover, which is on to me. So we'll do a whirlwind tour through the book. To begin with, Jim told us a little bit about you, but tell us a little bit more about you. What was your training to write a book, or to approach writing a book?
Sure. Well, first, thank you, Jim, and thank you, Frank, and thank you to the Nixon Library and Foundation for having me here today, and thanks to all of you for coming out. Really appreciate it. It's been my joy and pleasure to be talking about Get Me Carlucci. As you can imagine, I love sitting here talking about my father. It's one of my most favorite things to do. My background is I grew up in Washington, D.C., outside at the outskirts of Washington, D.C., and studied public policy at Duke University. I then went to Johns Hopkins University and studied international affairs. Kind of fully thought I would follow in my father's footsteps and go into a career in maybe the foreign service or government. And I got a bit derailed. I ended up marrying a military officer. And so we ended up traveling the world. I went into research instead and had a career with the Rand Corporation. So I went into international policy. So I worked in international policy with Rand for many years, hopping kind of all over the world with the Air Force. And so my background in writing and research kind of led me to pursue this avenue of writing this book. And the specific reason I ended up writing this book is because my father died in 2018. And the 10 years before he passed away, I was asking him to write down his memoirs. My dad was so humble and so he thought the idea of writing a book was so self-indulgent, he would have never done it. And I was prodding him. I had 3 small children. I know my dad was much older, and I really wanted my children to know him and know his life. So he wrote down his memoirs. I asked him, just write it down for family. And he wrote them down for family. And I was grateful. Our family was grateful.
What was the title? It was?
The title was A Life of Service.
Life of Service.
Yeah. So we titled it The Life of Service. And we were grateful, and we said, thanks, Dad. And we kind of put it aside on a shelf. And then 2020 rolled around, and I was going through, my grandmother had passed away. I was going through her belongings, and a friend of hers, another friend of the family, had found this book. And they read it, and they said, Kristin, I knew your dad's life was fascinating. Like, I kind of knew his name, which is kind of what I get from a lot of people. Like, I knew of him, but I didn't actually know what he did. Like, I didn't know he was stabbed in the back in the Congo. Like, he never told these stories. Because that's just who he was. And I said, yes. So I took the book and I said that was a sign that I needed to do something with it. That combined with my feeling on the kind of current polarization of our current democracy and my feelings about that, that people like him just don't exist anymore, or very few and far between. So that's what this book is.
We're going to talk a lot about your father tonight. Let's begin, just a brief minute. Tell us something about your mother.
Yeah.
They married in 1978 in Gibraltar, I believe.
Yeah.
And there they are.
Yeah, they did. So I adore that photo. That is right after they got married. And if my mom is watching this, she's going to be delighted to know this is on TV. But this is in Lisbon. My mom and dad met when my dad was working at HEW, and he was soon after nominated to be ambassador to Portugal. She accompanied him to Portugal, and it was my father's second marriage, and Portugal was a Catholic country. So they couldn't get married in Portugal. So they had to, and my dad was very busy in Portugal. So they had to fly to the Rock of Gibraltar which was not Catholic, and which was a British protectorate, and they got married there in one day. My brother, who was living with them, was the only witness to their marriage, and he threw rice.
He got the rice from the embassy cook
He got the rice from the embassy cook. He threw rice on them. They stayed one night at a naval base nearby, and then they flew right back. And they went on. They went on with their life in Portugal. So. Yeah.
Well, if your mom is watching, she looks pretty much the same today as she did then.
She'll be delighted to know you said that.
Did I suspect that the beginning of your writing career was a result of this?
Oh, yes, that was mine. So I was lucky enough to go on some amazing trips with my parents, two which were particularly memorable when I was young. The year was 1989, 1990. And my mother took me to, my parents took me to the Soviet Union and to China. They pulled me out of school, and I vividly remember, and both of these stories are in the book, but I vividly remember going to the Soviet Union, to going to Moscow, and going to China. And my mom handed me that Bart Simpson's notebook and said, you need to take a journal and describe your experiences while you're there. And I still have that journal. I still have the Bart Simpson's journal with what I saw, what I felt as a 9-year-old, 10-year-old kid in the Soviet Union and in China with my parents. And some of those recollections were, I didn't really like the hotel very much. It was right across the street from the Red Square, and it was just, my father was meeting with a minister, Minister Yazov, Defense Minister Yazov, and this is one of my favorite stories actually. And the dinners were long. For a 9-year-old, they were very long. I was required to attend. And he handed me a bear, a big black bear. And my mom turned to me and said, tell him you're going to name the bear Vodka. And I looked at my mom. I said, no, I don't like that name. I don't know what that is. And she said, no, tell him. He's going to like it. And I said, okay. And I said, all right, his name is Vodka. And the defense minister thought that was amazing and started laughing. So, yeah, that was the beginning of my writing career.
To begin at the beginning with Frank Carlucci the first, who came over from Italy and who became a very successful and meaningful businessman. Tell us about him.
Right, that was my great-grandfather. He came over from Salerno, Italy, which is right outside of Naples, and established himself. He was a stonemason. Established himself as a very successful stonemason in Pennsylvania, and kind of the Cliff Notes version is he ended up building part of Ellis Island. He also ended up building part of Arlington Cemetery, these stairways that lead up to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, where my father is buried not 20 yards away. So I didn't realize that until I wrote this book, which brought the whole kind of full circle moment for me.
And he set up a very successful stone importing company, and then he was called on to do prime things, opera houses and banks and all over the country.
He became very successful,
as you say. And it was also nicely ironic that he built the entry or the main building at Ellis Island where he had come
right.
As an immigrant before.
Right. That's right.
Nice story.
Yeah, that's right. So he had been, He had come over with, I think, high hopes and high aspirations for an American life, and he fully succeeded in that, especially in Pennsylvania and then in the broader Northeast area.
Then Frank Carlucci second with our subject as a boy.
That's right, so that's my grandfather and then my dad as a young boy. My grandfather was also in business, but not the family business. He was an insurance salesman, and he was also pretty successful. I think, you know, my father wasn't overly, my father wasn't a terribly talkative man in general. Didn't really talk that much about his upbringing, but I think his upbringing was fairly strict, and so his father was a fairly strict father. My dad didn't, you know, I always remember my dad as never liked to linger long at dinner, liked everything to be very, you know, he was very timely, and I think that came from his father, very strict on time. My dad was the same way.
You give some examples which are poignant, although I don't think they're terribly unusual, about the difficult or a particular dynamic between the father and son.
Yep.
The father was particularly into measured success by success in business.
Yes.
And so that even when your father was accomplishing these major jobs as a diplomat and things, the measure was always, well, how much are you being paid? Which of course the government salary was never much. And then, you know, it's not business. Although I think a lot of parents like that, they're critical face to face, but then they're bursting with pride when they talk outside.
There was some interesting, so I would look through, I have countless newspaper articles on my father from the 1950s all the way up to, you know, the 1990s. And you kind of slowly see the articles get grander and grander. You know, they start as kind of local Scranton boy, does good and learns Swahili and that type of thing. And then later on, there's an article about how, you know, Frank Carlucci Sr. is kind of starting to burst with joy about his son, right? And so I do think, you know, it was very unusual for my dad to decide to go into government service. That was frowned upon. Later on in actually my career, my dad, when I first went to college, my dad insisted that I go into engineering because that's what all the CEOs do and I should do that. And I thought, what are you saying? Like this is not what you did. And he said, well, that's what all, you know, that's what they're all engineers. You should do that. And I thought, isn't that ironic that you're imparting the same wisdom to me that your father imparted onto you and you promptly ignored. So I'm gonna promptly ignore your wisdom too.
And it's arguable that not only, but to please his father, he went to Harvard Business School for a year and didn't like it.
He didn't like it.
And then left to join the foreign service, to follow his passion, which was foreign service.
Right.
He went to Wyoming Seminary, which I think was not a religious school.
It's not. It still exists. In fact, my brother went there too. It still exists. It's, you know, in Scranton, Pennsylvania. It's not a religious school. It's a preparatory school for college. Yeah. Yeah, he went there for high school. He was an excellent student. He lived close by, and he was very active. My dad, his whole life, kind of practiced this idea of strong in mind, strong in body. So he was very active in wrestling and football, and you know.
And wrestling.
And wrestling. He was kind of the star of the wrestling team. This is his Wyoming Seminary wrestling team.
Well, and as we're about to see, in Princeton, and he was in the National Wrestling Hall of Fame.
Right.
Jim mentioned that you can be found on the tennis court. He played frequently competitive tennis every day when you're talking about his athletic regimen and discipline.
Right.
You know,
yeah, oftentimes people will still stop me and say, especially later in life, my dad was constantly trying to find a partner on the tennis court. So people will come up and say, your dad asked me to play tennis with them, you know. And then, yeah.
That's him in the middle and the back.
Yep.
And then he goes on to Princeton, class of 52, I think. And one of his classmates is Don Rumsfeld. Well, I shouldn't tell the story. Who was one of his classmates?
No, please, by all means. One of his classmates was Don Rumsfeld. They wrestled together. And, you know, for him to go in Princeton was a big deal for his family.
I was going to ask you, why did he choose Princeton?
I don't know why he chose it, actually. I never asked him that question. I think it was just, my guess is he did very well at Wyoming Seminary, and he got in there. But it was by far the best school that anybody in his family had ever been to, and it was extraordinary for him to go there. And at that point, you know, he made lifelong connections at Princeton, without a doubt.
And then right out of Princeton, he goes into the Navy.
He does.
What was that experience like for him?
Well, he has a very short-lived experience in the Navy. He gets stationed in Seattle and on a destroyer escort, which was a small ship. And if you were to ask him, he said it bobbed around off the Alaska coast. And he did not like that very much. I think he did not have the stomach for seafaring, so I think he probably got sick quite often. And he did not enjoy his Navy days. And that is probably all he would have told you. I don't think, you know, maybe he was a little embarrassed about it, I don't know. But it didn't last very quickly. It didn't last very long.
After an attempt at Harvard Business School, he decides he wants to join the Foreign Service. You describe in excruciating detail in your book what the exam, well, I think it's still like it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, what was the Foreign Service exam like?
Right, so, and it's still very similar. I mean, it's an incredibly difficult exam. He didn't think he was gonna pass it, and I think he took it on a whim. I think he still had this drive to see the world. He wanted to do it through the Navy originally, and then decided, no, I don't want to be on a ship. I want to do it through the Foreign Service. So you had to know all the countries around the world. They'd kind of ask you esoteric questions, and then can you speak a language? So he decides he's going to take this exam on a whim. He takes it in the back of a car, because he doesn't want anybody seeing that he's actually taking this exam.
He said that he lay down on the floor so that people wouldn't see him.
Yeah, he laid down the floor of the car so nobody was going to see him taking this exam, because he's supposed to be in business school and he actually wants to do this other thing and go see the world. And to his shock and awe, he passes, and he gets accepted into the Foreign Service.
And then he gets accepted with a vengeance, because his first 3 assignments were to hotspots, South Africa, Congo, and Zanzibar.
Right.
Tell about, he arrives in South Africa in 1957. Apartheid is the law of the land. And he, from the get-go, is not a maverick, but has a very particular approach and style to diplomacy.
Right. I mean, I don't think it's too far to say he's a maverick. He's just not, you know, he doesn't fall in line with the traditional Foreign Service officer, right? He decides in South Africa that he wants to do his own kind of political reporting. So South Africa, it's apartheid, so he decides to go to, there's the African National Congress at the time. He decides to go to some of their meetings and do some political reporting on what's happening in South Africa at the time. That was quite unusual, and it caught the attention of the United States and some people in South Africa. Like, who is this? My dad was very small. Who is this small white guy, blue-eyed, blonde hair, who's attending ANC meetings? And the Foreign Service, I think the Foreign Service were, a little like, what's happening here? He's soon after placed in the Congo, right? So very similar hotspot, a little different dynamic, but he's placed in the Congo 15 days before Congolese independence. So the Belgians were quickly leaving the Congo. The Congo was a Belgian colony. And the Congo was in chaos in 1960. It was not a place you wanted to be. And so in the book, I describe lots of different stories, but one in particular stands out, is that my dad was going to pick up an official, a U.S. official from the State Department at the airport, and his wife. So they're driving to the airport. They pick up this official from the airport and his wife, and they're driving back. And in the Congo during this time, you know, if a driver hit a bicyclist on the road, quite often the villagers would kill the driver. And that's exactly what happened. So the car was driving too fast, and the driver hit a bicyclist on the road. So my dad knew exactly what might happen, and the wife of the diplomat, the US diplomat, was in shock. So my dad jumped out of the car and went towards the villagers. And you can tell my dad's demeanor. This is why I try to keep a lot of his words in the book, because he says it was getting fairly serious when the crowds start to surround him and start beating him up. I think, that sounds serious, like real serious. He's so calm and mild-mannered. When a Congolese bus drives through the crowd, and he manages to get on, and it's only later that he sees blood pooling underneath him, and he had been stabbed in the back and almost murdered, but he survives that incident. But he kind of took the same approach in the Congo that he took in South Africa, in that, you know, he very much wanted to get the lay of the land. He had a press pass, and he rented his own Volkswagen car to go around the Congo to get to know people. He wasn't interested in, you know, the embassy chauffeured vehicle. He was very much, you know, kind of wanting to get to know people on an individual basis, and the leaders of the Congo.
In his book, which you quote, he said that Patrice Lumumba was the newly elected president of the Congo, and he said Lumumba governed at press conferences. So that's why he got a press pass, so he could go to these press conferences and again, not go around in a limo, which was just isolating and identifiable. And he just really, and he also would learn languages, which we'll come to. So the next posting was Zanzibar, which was an exotic place off the east coast of Africa. And it's an island. Now it's part of, then it was joined to Tanganyika, and it became Tanzania, which is Zanzibar. But what was the situation in Zanzibar when he arrives?
So Zanzibar, I learned, was kind of the Cuba of Africa. That's what they called it. My dad was sent there with only one other person, one or two other people. There was a NASA tracking station that the US was trying to get up and running again. But Zanzibar at the time had been overtaken by the Soviets and basically the Communist Party, the Chinese and the Soviets. And so he was one of two Americans there. There was a couple of Brits, and he was trying to, you know, have some sort of American presence there and trying to figure out how to do that. And so he got pretty familiar with the communist leader of Zanzibar, Karume, I believe his name was. And he would asked him, how do we make a difference here? How do I spread Western influence here? And the communist leader says, learn Swahili. And so he did. He decided to learn Swahili. And so he learned Swahili. My dad was a polyglot. He knew like 7 languages. He couldn't write them, but he could speak them. And so he decided to learn Swahili. And that combined with an incident where he was taken to a local island off the coast of Zanzibar. And when he went to visit this local island, it was run by the Communist Party. It was kind of a worker, they called it like a worker's paradise. So he didn't understand what anybody was saying, but everybody was chanting and shouting and pointing at him. And he asked his translator, you know, what are they saying? and his translator said, "Get rid of the Americans, get rid of that guy." And he said, right then, I knew learning Swahili was essential. And so he did. Later on, he was at a cocktail party, apparently, and he went back up to Karumbe, and the Soviet minister was there, the Soviet ambassador was there as well. My dad started speaking in Swahili to him, and Karumbe said to the Soviet ambassador, "Can you do that?" And he said, and he sheepishly said no and walked away. And so that, he ended up getting expelled from Zanzibar for various other reasons, but I do think those stories kind of paint a picture of, you know, how we operated in a time that was very dynamic and changing during this Cold War, this Cold War period.
We had, oh, sorry, I'm going backwards. One of the leaders, the local leaders in the Congo that your dad had befriended was Cyril Adula, who then became the prime minister, and with the director of the National Bank, came to Washington to meet with President Kennedy. And this is a picture of Prime Minister Adula in the I would say, the Blue Room. At any rate, that story sort of ties into the title of your book.
It does. It's kind of a precursor to the title of the book. So before my father was posted to Zanzibar, but after the Congo, this story is a bit legendary in the Foreign Service. So my dad had made such an impression in the Congo that when he was posted back to Washington, Cyril Adula, minister in the Congo, had come to meet with President Kennedy. My dad at this point is a nobody in the Foreign Service. And Cyril Adula is sitting with President Kennedy and asks him in French, "Où est Carlucci?" which in French is, "Where is Carlucci?" And President Kennedy says, "Who the hell is Carlucci?" And President Kennedy's chief of staff, I forget who it was at the time, but he goes, "Go get me that guy. I don't know who he is, but he clearly needs to be here at this meeting." So my dad says, I was shuffling suitcases at Blair House. He was, again, a nobody. And he's pulled up to the White House, and he sits in a meeting with President Kennedy, Cyril Adula, and you're right, the economic minister. And the translator hadn't showed up to this meeting. And so my dad, again, was pretty good with languages, so the chief of staff said, "Okay, the translator hasn't showed up, so you need to translate for the President of the United States, Cyril Adula, and the economic minister." So my dad says, well, the economic minister starts flying out of his mouth, starts saying all these numbers about the economic situation in the Congo, and he wants me to convert their monetary exchanges, and goes on for 5-10 minutes. And President Kennedy turns to me and says, "Well, what did he say?" And my dad says, "Mr. President, the situation is not very good." And he said that was the end of my translating days. But it was not the last time that he worked with a president.
So he's back from these exotic and dangerous posts, and he has a meeting. I love this story that you tell. He's had a meeting, so they're sort of assessing what's his future. He's done very well, but he's done it in an unconventional way. And so how do they get him back on track? And he's meeting with the Director General of the Foreign Service, who is an ambassador, Joseph Palmer. And you described that Palmer's desk is empty except for the Carlucci file. Mm-hmm. And what happens then?
Yeah, he basically says, "You're too freewheeling. You're not falling in line. You're not doing what we expect you to do. What are you doing? So we want you to be transportation officer in Rome." And my dad said, "I could not think of anything worse than being the transportation officer in Rome. I needed to find something else." So he ends up being reassigned through various means to Brazil. So he ends up going to Brazil.
He gets to Brazil, and there's a very interesting ambassador, Tuthill, who had worked for Eisenhower, who was a really interesting character in himself. And he, at one point, says to this young Carlucci, he says, "Who's the most useless person on the staff here?" And that begins the whole story.
Right. So originally, when he goes to Brazil, he's kind of supposed to be buried in the political section, and through various machinations, he gets up to the ambassador's attention. And the ambassador Tuthill kind of takes this viewpoint that he wants to reduce the number of staff in Brazil. He feels like he wants the Brazilians to be doing more for themselves and the Americans to be doing less. So basically sending Americans back to their postings in Washington. So he wants my dad to identify who's the most useless person here, which is kind of a thankless job. So my dad does so. He doesn't name any names, but he does so, and he says, but he is impossible to fire because everybody's coming to his defense. So, but in the end, they were able to reduce the staff at that embassy by a significant margin, which comes to the attention of Nixon.
Well, and Tuthill, after the first one, Tuthill says, well, why don't we get rid of half the staff? And has your dad draft this letter to the State Department saying, let's fire half the staff, which they do.
Yeah, not quite, but almost, yeah.
And it became known as Operation Topsy, where the staff had kind of grown out of control without anybody noticing it, and so cutting it back. And then one of his assignments at the embassy, Brazil embassy, was Nixon was on in each of the wilderness years from 62 to 68. He took a foreign trip. I think he took 7 foreign trips to different regions of the world, and one was to Latin and South America, and he went to Brazil, and your dad was his host, was his escort. And I'm sure they made, and we know they made an impression on each other. And Nixon was particularly impressed with this cutting down on the Foreign Service, or what Dulles would have called an agonizing reappraisal of the situation, and how many people do you need to get the job done. And as you're saying, what kind of job was it? Because these people were doing for the Brazilians
what they
instead
could do
of yes.
Yeah, my dad describes it as like bellboys and caddies and all these other things that there were Americans doing as opposed to Brazilians.
So Nixon's about to enter the story because your dad finally, the State Department, he's back from Brazil. They're going to send him to the Sloan School of Management at MIT to get an advanced degree.
That's right.
And his old Princeton wrestling team buddy, Donald Rumsfeld, had been taken from Congress by Nixon and appointed head of the Office of Economic Development. And your dad calls Don Rumsfeld and never makes it to Cambridge.
Yeah, no, I think he frames it as he's just checking in with his old friend Don Rumsfeld on his way to MIT. And Don says, how about instead you come work for me at OEO, the Office of Economic Opportunity. And my dad says jokingly, Don, I don't know a damn thing about poverty. Why would I come do that? And he said, no, just trust me. So so my dad does. He goes and works for Don Rumsfeld in this program called the Community Action Program. OEO was kind of set up by Johnson, as I understand it, as a poverty reduction program. And Rumsfeld wanted to move the program. My dad and Rumsfeld liked the program. They just wanted to move it to the states and make it less of a federal program. So that's what he was tasked to do. It's kind of move it to the states and decide which areas to keep and which areas not to keep, which programs to keep and which programs not to keep. So he went to each state and closed some programs and kept some programs open.
Then he joined the staff. Nixon had set up in 1970 the Office of Management and Budget, which today, 53 years later, is still flourishing and still powerful. Nixon's idea was that any program that was presented, some agency in the executive office of the president should analyze it in terms of how it was going to be managed, how its production was going to be measured, and what it was going to cost, instead of just proposing stuff without this idea of how programs would work down the road. And so the Office of Management and Budget was a very Nixonian idea, and arguably a very necessary idea, and is still around, so there must have been some merit to it. And the early people in it, the roster, Arnold Weber, George Shultz, Cap Weinberger, Fred Mallock, Paul O'Neill, Frank Carlucci, it really was a master class of management. This is a picture of Cap Weinberger and your dad, Frank Carlucci, in the Oval Office with Nixon. And then when Rumsfeld, Nixon, in the spring of '71, I think, Nixon calls Rumsfeld into the White House as counselor to the president at cabinet rank, and Frank Carlucci succeeds Don Rumsfeld as the director of the Office of Management, as the director of the Office of Economic Opportunity. And it was very controversial because the poverty people liked it, and the critics claimed that it wasn't being most effective, that it was putting a lot of money at problems, but the problems weren't necessarily being solved. So I thought we have a clip, short clip from your dad's first press conference as the new director of the Office of Economic Opportunity, and he gets it's a civilized, but it's a critical question from a reporter.
Mm-hmm. Isn't it a fact that there has been rather sharp criticism of all the OEO operations in local communities, and specifically the legal services programs around the country? And I'm wondering how significant that criticism has been in the call for redesigning or reshaping of the program.
Well, let me emphasize that it is not envisaged that the legal services program would be funded through the revenue sharing mechanism. That would be a separate corporation. It is envisaged that effective January 1st, 1973, resources for community action would come through special revenue sharing. Certainly there have been criticisms of the community action program. This was particularly true around the time of the 1968 elections. On the other hand, I think that we have made an awful lot of progress in establishing a good dialogue between community action agencies and local officials. I myself conducted a series of seminars around the country involving mayors and community action agency directors. I was greatly heartened to see what transpired at these seminars. I think there is a mutual respect.
I think it's interesting. It's a young man who is in a controversial situation. The question is critically intended, and he fields it well, with facts, respectfully. Sort of was the tone that he brought to his work. The next thing that came up,
Director.
When he becomes director of the Office of Economic Opportunity, John Ehrlichman, the domestic advisor, says to him, well, you should meet Nixon. He'd seen him and met him, but you should actually go in now that you're director and meet Nixon. So this was an oral history that was done, I think, in 2006 here at the Nixon Library. And this is Frank Carlucci describing this meeting with Nixon in 1971.
When I became director of OEO, or was nominated to be director of OEO, Don said to me, you ought to have a conversation with the president. And this was what, 1968? 1969, I guess. We had no relations with China at the time. Don and I went into the Oval Office, just the three of us, President, Don, and myself. And Nixon said, Frank, you're a Foreign Service officer, aren't you? And I said, yes, Mr. President. He said, well, where'd you serve? And I said, mainly Africa. He said, Africa, going nowhere. The place you ought to think about is China. You go over and manage that damn place. He hated OEO. And after 2 years, we'll send you to China. I walked out of the office saying, what's he talking about? We don't have relations with China. 2 years later, almost to the day, Kissinger went on TV saying Richard Nixon was going to China. So I am living witness that Nixon came into office thinking about reestablishing relations with China.
Next thing that comes up is Hurricane Agnes, which today, with instant news, we see hurricanes and we see storms all over the world. Hurricane Agnes was something in the summer of '72. It was, in a way, a perfect storm. It came out of the Caribbean. It did minimal damage in Florida and the southeast. It went out to sea, but instead of dissipating, it roiled, was joined by a storm coming down, a cold storm coming down from the north, and then they came inland. And really, it was unprecedented, particularly in Pennsylvania and New York.
Yeah. And it hit where my dad grew up, right? So it hit that Wyoming Valley, Wilkes-Barre, Scranton area. So I think it meant a lot to my dad. And you have here a picture of my dad and Nixon. To be basically appointed this personal representative of the president to help with the flood relief efforts there. I mean, it did $3.5 billion of damage. And in that area were my father's friends and relatives. And so I think when he was appointed, he was at OMB at the time, when he was appointed by Nixon to go there and take control of the federal relief efforts, which seems strange right now as somebody at OMB to go take, take control of flood relief efforts. He took the job seriously, and he went and he set up in a trailer, and on the trailer it said, personal or government representative to the personal representative to your government, and he would go meet with people every day from the area, and you and Frank and I were talking earlier today. It meant a lot to people there. They were very welcoming, and they appreciated it, and they saw, I think, in my dad, the government helping them in a way that they had not seen before.
When it hit, there were a number of dozens of programs and dozens of agencies, but some of them competing and with little or no communications between them. So nothing was actually reaching the people. There were a lot of representatives saying, we promised this, but nothing was reaching. And it reached a crisis point. So Nixon said, get Me Carlucci. We need somebody who we know can fix this. And as you say, he went up and lived there. This is at Camp David. Carlucci comes up to report to Nixon, and he says to him, you should really go and look at it. And Nixon says, when? And Frank says, now. And they go out, they fire up, Nixon says, well, let me go change. And they fire up Marine One, and they fly to, I stepped on your story. So they go up, and they're going through the devastation, right. Driving through this ruined city, Wilkes-Barre.
Yeah, I mean, it was under complete water, and I know, and you said, it's hard to imagine now because we see hurricanes all the time. I mean, I was living in Houston during Hurricane Harvey, so I know what it feels like, but then it was kind of an extraordinary event. So Nixon came and kind of did a tour of the damages, and here you have a picture of, the story goes, he was driving along and saw a crowd forming outside of a church and told his Secret Service, stop, I want to get out. And so he pops out of the car, and I think everybody was like, what are you doing? But he pops out of the car and gets in the picture of this wedding.
This was a great success. Nixon went up on another trip, and he's speaking from a porch to this crowd that had been disgruntled before and very dissatisfied. And thanks to Frank Carlucci's presence up there a couple of weeks or a couple of months, and so Nixon comes up sort of on what turned out to be a triumphal visit.
You stand here by me because I want to mention you at the time. Hi, thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate the opportunity to meet so many of you on this visit to Wilkes-Barre, and also to express appreciation to those in the government who are working here, and particularly to Frank Carlucci, who symbolizes the government effort. He came from... He came, of course, from Wilkes-Barre, and he's a strong man. He's a very intelligent man, and he cares about people. And I think what I like about his effort most of all is that he has personalized the government. You know, you usually think of the government, all that money that it has, and all of the agencies. There's HUD, and there's HEW, and all those initials. But in Frank Carlucci, you see a man who cares. He talks to every individual person. That's what we want your government to be, one that cares about each of you individually. Now, I also realize that as we look at this effort here, that a lot remains to be done. This has been a devastating flood. I saw what had happened in Harrisburg when I visited right after the floods. I've had an opportunity to see what the situation is here months after the floods have occurred. And I know that as I drove through the business district and through the residential districts that so many places of business, so many houses still remain to be rebuilt. And as a result, many are living in these government facilities, the trailers, the mobile homes that we have just looked at. I wondered when I came up to Wilkes-Barre, I wondered, of course, whether Carlucci was doing a good job. I know he is. I wondered whether or not we were providing the money that we should, and I know that we're providing a great deal, and of course we will provide what is necessary, what we can. And I wondered too whether the federal agencies were working together rather than against each other. Due to Carlucci, they're working together, and they're not fighting each other, they're fighting the problem.
In 1975, he's been named ambassador to Portugal. And here's a picture with the Prime Minister, Suarez. But that's sort of the happy ending to a more difficult story. What was the situation in Portugal when your dad arrived?
Right. So last week, actually, well, April 25th, that was last week, Portugal celebrated their 50 years of democracy. April 25th was the celebration of the Carnation Revolution in Portugal. The Carnation Revolution was the end of a very long dictatorship in Portugal. And that marked the start of my dad's involvement in Portugal. So during that period, from the start of the Carnation Revolution, up in, the U.S. and Portugal had a stable relationship. Kissinger was Secretary of State. After that revolution, Kissinger feared, because the revolution was very leftist, Kissinger feared Portugal was a NATO country. Kissinger was absolutely convinced that Portugal was going to turn communist. And my dad had a reputation of kind of being a fixer, tough guy. So Kissinger wanted my dad to go over to Portugal. Now, and so he wanted him to be the ambassador over there. So during this period, this kind of turbulent period where the U.S. didn't quite know what was going to happen in Portugal, my dad became the ambassador, and he went over there. And just as he had done in kind of the Congo and Zanzibar and Brazil, he landed, and he knew Portuguese from being in Brazil. And he landed, and he immediately made himself available to the Portuguese press, which were quite leftist, which I think surprised a lot of the Americans back home. But and he also spoke Portuguese, which he was the first American ambassador ever to speak the language. He also kind of took the same approach to diplomacy that he had before, and he decided every day he was going to speak to 3 or 4 Portuguese leaders and really figure out what was happening. And not only Portuguese leaders, but a range of people like religious leaders. Portuguese is a very Catholic country, so he thought it was important to speak to religious leaders, everything from religious leaders to his security staff and the bellboys and everybody. And over time, his assessment of the situation in Portugal differed significantly from Kissinger's, which was kind of rare at the time. You know, Kissinger was a very strong...
Not something Kissinger was used to.
Not something Kissinger was used to. But Kissinger wanted to make very firm statements against Portugal, and my dad was urging him to back off. My dad was convinced that if given a chance, that democracy would prevail in Portuguese politics for many reasons. One, Portugal was a Catholic country. It was a conservative country. And because of its NATO ties, also because it had no natural land boundaries to any other communist countries. But for all those various reasons, he truly believed that. And he took that message back to Kissinger. And Kissinger replied to him, well, if you're so goddamn smart, you make all the statements. And he said, well, thank you, I will. That's kind of the Cliff Notes version of it. I think the dialogue lasted a little bit longer than that.
I think you've summarized it perfectly.
And history proved my dad correct. Mario Suarez, the individual you see in the picture there, would go on to be the first he was a socialist, democratically elected leader of Portugal. Portugal is now, as I mentioned at the beginning, celebrating 50 years of democracy. And in his honor, the American residence where the ambassador lives in Lisbon in 2019 was named Casa Carlucci, kind of signifying how important it was during that turbulent period for the U.S. to show faith that we believed that Portugal could stand firm in faith in democracy. You know, the Portuguese people did that on their own, but it was important for my father to do what he did. So not only is the residence there named after him, but the American school there is also named after him.
We'll give the last word to Henry Kissinger.
We were both extremely interested and concerned about the consequences of the revolution in Portugal. Frank thought that being on the spot and knowing the situation, he was entitled to try his approach first. Frank deserves the credit because his proposals were better suited to Portuguese psychology and Portuguese conditions. Frank was an advocate of working within Portugal with groups that were sympathetic to the United States, but also understood that Portugal had its own history, and he convinced me that that was the better approach. And I'm very proud to have had him as somebody who technically worked for me, but made us all look better by being strong enough and thoughtful enough to persist on his course.
With Jimmy Carter elected president, your dad very likely thought, having worked for, Kennedy and others, but he probably thought he was going to be looking for a new job. But quality is recognized, and so he had offers from Cyrus Vance, Secretary of State, to go to state, and from Admiral Stansfield Turner, to go to work for the CIA, and your dad became deputy director of the CIA in the Carter administration.
He did. And actually, it was during that, it was right around that time period, it was actually right after that time period that the title of this book was born, Get Me Carlucci, because it was during that time period that the Washington Post wrote an article about him that said, Get Me Carlucci is what all of these presidents who have very little in common have said. So what are the qualities that define that man? And that's kind of what I try to answer in the book is, what is it? But yes, he went on to work with, under Stansfield Turner at the agency, really in a management role. I think Stansfield Turner was known for cutting a lot of staff at that time. So he was...
They cut 800,
Yeah.
It was known as?
The Halloween Massacre.
Yeah, we had the Saturday Night Massacre, but you had the Halloween Massacre, which was on Halloween of 1977.
Yeah, yeah. So they cut quite a bit of staff, and that is about the extent of it.
With Reagan elected, your dad becomes Cap Weinberger becomes the Secretary of Defense and asks him to become the Deputy Secretary of Defense, which he does.
Right.
And then he brings back Colin Powell, who he had met at OMB. And this begins a friendship and a relationship that lasts for both of their lifetimes. Right. What was the Carlucci-Powell dynamic, and how did he keep bringing him back from Europe and interrupting his Army career?
Oh, okay. So, my dad and Colin first met at OMB, actually, and then...
Colin was a White House fellow.
Yes,
Yep.
yeah. And then my dad was so impressed with him, he brought him to be his military assistant when he was Deputy Secretary of Defense under Weinberger. And, you know, the thing that stuck with me, I was privileged enough to interview Colin a month or two before he died. He was a really close family friend, and the thing that always stuck with me is that their relationship, although it was somewhat mentor-mentee, it was defined by mutual respect and admiration. My dad thought the world, and this is a quote actually from Colin, is that he thought the world of him, and I thought the world of him. It was just this kind of just mutual admiration and respect. And so my dad brought him as his military assistant at DOD. And then when my father was much later on, asked to be National Security Advisor under the Reagan administration, the only person he wanted as his deputy was Colin. Now, Colin at that point had only been in the military, so he was assigned to Germany at the time. Him and Alma had moved to Germany. And so my dad calls him in Germany, and Colin's probably going to tell this story in this video, but my dad called him and said, guess what? I've now been nominated to be and accepted this post as National Security Advisor. I would really like it if you joined me, come back to Washington as my deputy. And Colin basically says, no, thank you. Like, I thought you were calling to tell me the good news and you wanted me to congratulate you, but I'm in this really primo spot in Germany and I'd really like to stay here. I've barely unpacked my bags. And he says, it's really gonna take a call from the president. And so later that evening, he gets the phone rings. Colin tells me this, tells me the story. The phone rings, he picks it up. He says, okay, Mr. President, I'm coming back. So he returns to Washington to be my dad's number 2 at the National Security Advisor. And then the other story that I really love, I just think it shows such humility and grace and understatedness, is that they're working together, National Security Advisor, and then they're in this big meeting. And Colin ends up running a lot of these meetings. My dad is not really interested in running these meetings, and my dad gets pulled out. Cap Weinberger has resigned as Secretary of Defense. My dad gets pulled out. He's told he's going to be the next Secretary of Defense. And Colin's wondering what his, he's running this meeting. He's wondering where my dad went, why everybody's leaving. My dad returned, I think he gets pulled out with George Shultz. They come back. My dad literally hands him a piece of paper, slides it over and says, "Congrats, you're the new National Security Advisor." And he picks it up. And he's like, "How do I say no to that? Like, I couldn't say no the first time. I guess I can't say no the second time." But it's this understatedness, this not, the no nonsense of, well, of course I'm gonna do it, relationship.
You tell the story with great detail and with documents and such like in the book. Colin summarizes it.
And Contra scandal.
Yep.
New National Security Advisor Frank Carlucci came in, and he wanted you as his deputy.
And I said, "Frank, it can't be that important." He says, "It is that important." So then I said, "Okay, see if you can risk your entire career by saying the next sentence." I said, "Well, Frank, if it's that important, why doesn't the president call me?" Half hour later.
You had a call from?
"Hello, General Powell. This is Ronald Reagan." "Yes, sir." "I really, really want you to come back here." He's reading the talking points that Frank gave him. "I really, really want you to come back here and be the Deputy National Security Advisor." "Yes, sir, I'll be right there."
So you came back?
Yeah. 9 months later, Frank got assigned to become the Secretary of Defense, and I'm saying, good, I can go back to the Army now. And then one day I was chairing a National Security Council meeting, and suddenly the door opens and the president walks in, gets to the head of the table, and Frank comes around to the side. And while the meeting is going on, Frank rips off a piece of paper, scribbles something on it, and he sends it down the table to me. And I open up the little piece of paper and it says, "You're now the National Security Advisor." No interview, no nothing. So the last year and a half of my time in the White House was with President Reagan. Became an extremely close and strong relationship.
There's so much to tell and so little time, so I'm going to move ahead real fast now to your dad becomes Secretary of Defense. And one of the first things that's happened, President Reagan is devoted to arms control, and they passed the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Armaments Treaty to control them. But there is considerable opposition to it, particularly in the Republican Party and on the part of President Nixon. What have we got here? So can you tell the story of how your dad brought Nixon back to the White House to consult with Ronald Reagan in this situation?
Sure. So my dad knew that there was opposition within the Republican Party about this, and Ronald Reagan knew that as well. And so my dad asked Ronald Reagan, "Who would you like to hear from? Who would you like to consult with on this?" And he named a number of names. Henry Kissinger, he went through a list, and he named Nixon. He said, "Do you want to hear from Nixon, Nixon's point of view?" And at that point, Ronald Reagan said, "Yes, I want to hear from him." So my dad brought him in, and he brought him in through the back entryway of the White House. And and Nixon talked to Reagan, and he just kind of sat there quietly for a couple of hours. And the only people in the room during that time period were Baker, Carlucci, Nixon, and Reagan. And that picture was taken.
And Baker took this picture.
He did, yeah.
We'll post this online as part of this program. This is a very interesting piece of the oral history where your dad talks about going up to that meeting, how when he was named Secretary of Defense, Nixon wrote him a 6-page letter about the job and what he could do and Frank was so moved by it and impressed by it that he went up to New Jersey and spent an afternoon with Nixon, who then drove him to the airport so they could continue the conversation. And as Frank says, he knew that Nixon had written every word of the letter himself. And so when Reagan was receptive to this idea, Frank was able to bring him down. So we'll post that oral history as a supplement to this program.
I was gone.
And then, moving along very
Quickly.
fast, and he he goes into business. And to put it mildly, he is very successful because he becomes a co-founder and partner of the Carlyle Group. What is the Carlyle Group? What is and was the Carlyle Group?
So he comes on as chairman, not co-founder, but chairman of the Carlyle Group, which is an investment firm, and kind of comes on when it's a small boutique firm that ends up being, one of the preeminent firms of its time.
Investment capital.
Yeah, investment capital firm. And it's during this period that, the world is globalizing. So it's a great period for him to be a part of it because he really has this breadth and depth of knowledge of the global, how to operate in the global environment. So it's a kind of mutually beneficial relationship, both for Carlyle and for my dad, who also, on top of being at Carlyle, joins lots of different boards because, for him, his time was a precious commodity for him in the later years of his life, and he really wanted to devote it to as many kind of different causes and as he could.
One of the most impressive things about Frank Carlucci's career was the price he paid for it, for public service. I think, as well you say in your book, as Secretary of Defense, he was making, his salary was $60,000 a year, which in current money is about $205,000, which is a lot of money, but not if you have to live in Washington, if you have 2 kids in school or 3 kids,
and
3 and 2 in college, and that was the most he made. That was sort of the high point of his salary to that point. If he had gone out into business, he could have made, double or more, 10 times more, which he did when he finally left. But the sacrifice that he made and that you made, that the family made, in order for him to keep doing, to serving these presidents, to serving the public interest, to just being a good citizen, is not the least important part of his story and should be honored and remembered.
Right.
And so he goes out into Carlisle and is busy and on boards, as you say, and is playing tennis all the time and is keeping up, is in great shape. And then in 2004, he notices he's got just a little tremor in his left hand, and that's not a good sign.
No. He lived the remainder of his life with Parkinson's, which, we were very grateful because my dad, at the beginning of this talk, I said he was he believed and preached strong mind, strong body, and he lived that through and through. And I believe that really helped him with his Parkinson's battle because he had Parkinson's for well over 10 years, maybe 12. And even with the best of care, Parkinson's can be so detrimental. But he, and even here, he went and advocated on Capitol Hill for stem cell research, which, I was talking to a doctor actually this weekend. I had forgotten, now stem cell research has advanced so much, but at the beginning it was kind of controversial. So, he was really still promoting the public good, giving back in public service in ways that he could, even when suffering from Parkinson's. And even early on, and even in the book I had mentioned, when I was in high school, he was at Carlisle, he suffered from, he had a quintuple heart bypass. I was in high school, and I remember him saying, just go back to school, it'll be fine. And I looked at somebody, and somebody looked at me, and they were like, quintuple, isn't that all the arteries in your heart? And I was like, I think so. But he was just so mild-mannered, just, carry on.
So this is a family picture. Is this a graduation? He's got, it says
so it's
Pardo School there.
It's an honorary degree.
Oh, honorary
so this
degree.
is actually here in California. This is at Rand. So I worked, like I said, at Rand for many years. My husband got his graduate degree from the Rand Pardee School of Policy Analysis, and my dad was honored with an honorary degree there. So that's my husband, who's like twice as tall as the rest of my family, and that's my mom and me and my dad. Yeah.
So your dad was 87 when he died in June, so the 8th anniversary is just coming up in a couple of months. How did you and your family deal with that loss?
Towards the end, I recognize the immense burden we put on caregivers in this country. So my mom was his primary caregiver in the last, 2 years of his life, 3 years of his life, and that was hard, in all honesty. So I think we lost a huge part of our family when he died, and that was a process for all of us to bear, like when anybody loses a loved one. But we also recognize that, the whole process of losing somebody that's suffering from a debilitating disease, there's many layers to that, and we all had to work through that, including the part that deals with caregiving.
Summing up, how do you look back on Frank Carlucci's life, lessons? What does his life have to say to us today?
The reason I wrote this book, or I co-wrote it with my father, I wish he could see it. Though I think if he did see it, he'd probably say, "Why did you write a book about me?" I mean, isn't that the point? Humility is undervalued. Public service is undervalued and underappreciated. I want young people to hear stories of public servants that people can devote their lives to public service, that can serve both parties. I want that to exist in our country. I hope that can exist in our country. I see him as a vision, a beacon of somebody that really wanted to do good and did. And I hold him up to that model. And I've spoken to young people and I've told his story, and I think those two messages really resonate. One, they don't hear positive stories of public service and with our current political divide. And two, it's very rare to hear stories of humility in leadership. And so I think those two are kind of the most important messages here.
Who chose if he chose his major accomplishments for his tombstone, they are Navy Lieutenant, Secretary of Defense, U.S. Ambassador, and? Beloved
Bumpa, yeah. So he's buried in Arlington National Cemetery, and in Arlington National Cemetery, your service goes first, your military service goes first. So Lieutenant in U.S. Navy had to go before Secretary of Defense, which is interesting, right? I don't know that he would have loved that, but whatever. And then Beloved Bumpa was,
That's how he was known universally to all the
all of my children, all the
grandchildren.
Yeah. He was known as Bumpa. His father was also known as Bumpa, so he was known as Bumpa, and my mom is known as Nana. So.
Well, thank you very much for coming tonight to the Nixon Library, telling us the story of a great man and a beloved Bumpa, and Kristin Carlucci Weed.
Kristin, Frank, thank you very much. As Frank said, thank you for this inspirational peek into such a patriotic story. I wish we had more time, but the good news is the stories are all in her book, which she has agreed to sign up in our front lobby and is available for sale. So please pick up a copy and we'll meet you out in the front lobby shortly. Thanks for coming. Have a good night.
Thank you.